Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepy Facts Show. Tonight, we'll be exploring fascinating facts about the Black Death. As you settle in, feel free to let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you'd like to support the show, you can find those details in the description. But for now, just get comfortable and we'll ease into tonight's topic. The Black Death was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, striking Europe between 1347 and 1351. During those few years, entire towns and cities were transformed almost overnight by illness and fear. Streets that had once been crowded with merchants, craftsmen, and travelers became quiet as people fell sick or fled. The scale of death was so immense that many communities would take generations to recover. The Black Death was part of a much longer disease event known as the Second Plague Pandemic. This pandemic stretched far beyond a single outbreak and continued in waves for centuries. Periodic plague outbreaks returned to Europe and parts of Asia well into the 1600s. The initial outbreak in the 14th century, however, remains the most infamous and destructive phase. The disease responsible for the Black Death was caused by a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. This microscopic organism infected animals and humans, attacking the body's immune system and causing severe illness. Though medieval people had no way of seeing or understanding bacteria, modern science has confirmed its role in the pandemic. Today, this same bacterium is still studied carefully by epidemiologists and historians. The bacterium Yersinia pestis usually spreads through fleas that live on rodents. When infected fleas bite humans, they can transmit the bacteria into the bloodstream. Rats, which thrived in medieval towns and ports, served as common hosts for these fleas. This chain of fleas, rodents, and humans helped the disease move silently through populations. Many historians believe the Black Death likely began somewhere in Central Asia. The disease may have circulated among wild rodent populations there long before it reached major cities. Trade routes such as the Silk Road played an important role in spreading the plague westward. These routes connected China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe through a vast network of caravans and markets. Along these routes, goods like silk, spices, and precious metals moved between continents. Unfortunately, disease could travel along those same paths. One of the earliest well-documented outbreaks connected to the Black Death occurred in the Crimean port city of Kaffa in 1346. Kaffa was a busy trading hub on the Black Sea controlled by Italian merchants. When plague broke out there, it quickly spread among soldiers, traders, and civilians. From this port, the disease soon reached ships traveling toward Europe. Merchant ships played a crucial role in spreading the Black Death across the Mediterranean Sea. Ships arriving in port sometimes carried crews who were already sick or dying. Rats living aboard the ships also carried infected fleas. When the ships docked, the disease could spread rapidly into the port cities. The plague first entered Europe through major Italian port cities such as Messina, Genoa, and Venice. These cities were major centers of commerce and received ships from across the Mediterranean. Because they were so connected to global trade, they were also especially vulnerable to disease. Once the plague arrived, it quickly moved inland. Some ships arriving in European ports became known as death ships. Sailors and passengers aboard were often already ill when they reached harbor. In some cases, nearly the entire crew died before the vessel arrived. When authorities realized what was happening, fear spread quickly through port cities. After arriving in Europe, the Black Death spread with incredible speed. Medieval cities were crowded places where people lived close together. Waste disposal was poor, and animals often roamed freely through the streets. These conditions made it easy for disease to move from person to person. Sanitation in medieval towns was extremely limited by modern standards. Garbage, food scraps, and animal waste often accumulated in streets and alleyways. Such environments created ideal conditions for rats and fleas to thrive. These factors unintentionally helped the plague spread through urban populations. Rats were common inhabitants of medieval towns and cities. They were attracted to grain stores, markets, and homes where food was available. By 1348, the plague had spread through much of Western Europe. Countries such as France, Spain, and England soon experienced devastating outbreaks. News of the disease traveled almost as quickly as the illness itself. Fear spread as reports arrived of towns where thousands had already died. Within only a few years, the plague had reached most regions of Europe. From Mediterranean ports, it spread north into Germany and Scandinavia. It also moved east into parts of Russia and south into the Middle East. Few areas connected to trade networks were able to escape its reach. The Black Death also struck regions beyond Europe, including North Africa. Cities across the Mediterranean world experienced severe outbreaks. Some regions lost half their population in only a few years. Such sudden demographic collapse had enormous consequences for society. Farms were abandoned, businesses closed, and entire neighborhoods became empty. For many survivors, the world suddenly felt much quieter and more uncertain. The Black Death remains one of the deadliest pandemics ever recorded. Few other diseases have caused such a sudden and widespread loss of life. Its impact reshaped societies across Europe and beyond. Historians still study it as a turning point in world history. Estimates suggest that the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people worldwide. Because medieval records were incomplete, the exact number is difficult to determine. Even the lowest estimates represent a massive human tragedy. Entire generations were affected by the sudden loss of family members and neighbors. Europe alone may have lost between 30 and 50% of its population during the pandemic. Some regions experienced even higher mortality rates. With so many people gone, everyday life changed dramatically. Labor shortages and abandoned property became common. Florence, Italy, is often cited as one of the cities most heavily affected by the plague. Some historical estimates suggest around 60% of its population died. The shock of the disaster deeply influenced the city's culture and literature. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio described these events vividly in his famous work, The Decameron. In many places, burial systems quickly became overwhelmed. Cemeteries that normally handled a few deaths each week suddenly faced hundreds. Gravediggers could not keep up with the constant demand for new burials. As a result, cities had to develop faster and less ceremonial ways of disposing of the dead. Mass graves became a grim necessity during the height of the pandemic. Large pits were dug where multiple bodies could be buried at once. Sometimes bodies were layered with soil between them, but in many cases, they were simply placed together quickly. Archaeologists have discovered many of these plague pits centuries later. Traditional funeral rituals were often abandoned during the worst outbreaks. Normally, families and priests would gather for prayers and burial ceremonies. During the plague, however, there were often too many deaths for such customs to continue. Many victims were buried quickly without formal rites. In some cities, bodies remained inside homes for days before they could be removed. Families were sometimes too frightened or too weak to handle the dead themselves. Special carts eventually moved through the streets to collect bodies. The sight of these carts became one of the most haunting symbols of the plague. The constant presence of death deeply affected daily life. Church bells rang frequently for funerals, creating an almost continuous sound across many towns. The smell of decay lingered in crowded neighborhoods. For many people, the experience created a lasting sense of fear and uncertainty. The most common form of plague during the Black Death was bubonic plague. This form of the disease attacks the lymphatic system. It typically causes painful swelling in lymph nodes, which became one of the most recognizable symptoms. These swellings were often large and extremely tender. The swollen lymph nodes caused by the disease were known as buboes. They usually appeared in areas such as the groin, neck, or armpits. These swellings could grow to the size of eggs or even small apples. The pain they caused was often described as intense. Many victims experienced sudden high fever as the infection spread through their bodies. This fever was often accompanied by chills and severe weakness. People who had appeared healthy one day could become seriously ill the next. The rapid progression of symptoms made the disease especially frightening. Extreme fatigue was another common symptom of plague infection. Victims often became too weak to stand or walk within a short time. As the illness progressed, the body struggled to fight the bacteria spreading through the bloodstream. This weakness left many people unable to care for themselves. Dark patches sometimes appeared on the skin of plague victims. These discolorations were caused by bleeding beneath the skin as the infection spread. Some historians believe these marks contributed to the name Black Death. The sight of these dark spots was often seen as a sign that death was near. Many victims died only 3 to 5 days after symptoms appeared. This extremely fast progression made the disease particularly devastating. Families often watched loved ones become ill and die within the span of a single week. The speed of the illness added to the sense of helplessness. Another dangerous form of the disease was pneumonic plague. Unlike bubonic plague, this version infected the lungs. Victims often coughed violently and struggled to breathe. Pneumonic plague was even more deadly than the bubonic form. Pneumonic plague could spread directly between people through coughing or sneezing. This made it far more contagious than the flea-borne form of the disease. A single sick person could infect others in the same room. As a result, outbreaks could grow very quickly. Some cases developed into septicemic plague, where the disease spread throughout the bloodstream. This form caused severe internal bleeding and shock. Victims sometimes died before other symptoms even appeared. Septicemic plague was almost always fatal in the medieval period. Medieval doctors had no understanding of bacteria or germs. The scientific knowledge needed to explain disease transmission simply did not yet exist. physicians relied instead on ancient medical theories inherited from Greek and Roman writers. These ideas shaped how people attempted to treat the plague. One common explanation for disease was the theory of miasma, or bad air. People believed that foul smells or poisonous vapors caused illness. As a result, many tried to protect themselves by burning herbs or carrying fragrant plants. These practices were intended to purify the surrounding air. Others believed the plague was a punishment sent by God. In this view, the disaster reflected humanity's sins and moral failures. Religious leaders encouraged prayer, repentance, and acts of charity. Many people turned more strongly toward faith during the crisis. Astrology was also used to explain the outbreak. Some scholars believed unusual alignments of planets had poisoned the air or disrupted nature. Astrological charts were sometimes studied in hopes of predicting future outbreaks. Although these theories were incorrect, they reflected the scientific thinking of the time. Bloodletting was one treatment sometimes recommended by physicians. Doctors believed removing blood might restore balance to the body. This idea came from the medieval theory of bodily humors. Unfortunately, bloodletting often weakened patients who were already dangerously ill. Herbal remedies and potions were also widely used. Physicians prescribed mixtures of herbs, spices, and minerals in hopes of curing the disease. Some of these remedies may have provided mild comfort, but did not stop the infection. Most treatments were based on guesswork rather than scientific evidence. During later plague outbreaks, doctors sometimes wore distinctive protective clothing. These outfits included long robes, gloves, and masks shaped like bird beaks. Although these famous masks became associated with plague doctors, they appeared mainly in later centuries. They were not widely used during the earliest Black Death outbreaks. The beak-shaped masks were filled with aromatic herbs or spices. Doctors believed these materials would filter out dangerous air. Ingredients such as lavender, cloves, or rose petals were commonly used. While ineffective against bacteria, the strong smells may have made working around the sick more tolerable. Despite all these treatments, medieval medicine could do little to stop the disease. Most doctors could only offer comfort and advice to the sick. Many physicians themselves became infected while treating patients. The limitations of medicine were painfully clear during the pandemic. The inability to cure the disease created widespread fear. People watched neighbors, friends, and family members fall ill without explanation. Rumors and misinformation spread alongside the illness. Communities struggled to understand what was happening. Even so, some early forms of public health began to appear. City leaders started experimenting with rules designed to limit contact between the sick and healthy. Although these measures were imperfect, they represented the beginnings of organized responses to disease. Over time, such ideas would evolve into modern public health practices. The Black Death caused widespread panic across Europe. News of entire towns falling ill spread quickly through travelers and merchants. People often fled cities in hope of escaping infection. Unfortunately, many unknowingly carried the disease with them. Many families made desperate decisions when sickness entered their homes. Some people abandoned relatives who had fallen ill out of fear of infection. Others tried to care for loved ones despite the danger. These choices created deep emotional scars long after the plague ended. Large cities saw waves of people attempting to leave as the disease spread. Wealthier families often escaped to rural estates or country homes. This pattern is famously described in literature from the time. However, many poorer residents had no way to leave. Religious practices intensified during the pandemic. Churches filled with people seeking comfort and protection through prayer. Many believed repentance might stop the spread of the disease. Religious processions became common in towns and cities. Some groups, called flagellants, traveled across Europe during the plague. These individuals believed public acts of penance would appease God. They marched from town to town, whipping themselves as a sign of repentance. Crowds sometimes gathered to watch these dramatic rituals. Flagellant movements occasionally attracted thousands of followers. Their gatherings were emotional and often highly theatrical. People hoped that such displays of repentance would bring divine mercy. Leaders within the Catholic Church grew concerned about the flagellant groups. Some believed these gatherings spread disorder and panic. Large crowds also increased the risk of disease transmission. As a result, authorities attempted to suppress the movement. During the chaos of the pandemic, many communities searched for someone to blame. Rumors spread that certain groups were responsible for the disease. These accusations were often based on fear rather than evidence. Unfortunately, they led to terrible violence. Jewish communities across Europe were often falsely accused of causing the plague. Some people claimed Jews had poisoned wells or deliberately spread the disease. These accusations had no basis in reality. Nevertheless, they sparked widespread persecution. Massacres and expulsions of Jewish communities occurred in several European cities. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed and thousands of people were killed. In some cases, authorities attempted to stop the violence. In many others, they did little to protect the victims. The massive death toll of the Black Death created severe labor shortages. Farms, workshops, and businesses suddenly lacked workers. With fewer workers available, surviving laborers could demand higher wages. Employers had little choice but to offer better pay or improved conditions. This represented a major shift from earlier centuries when labor was abundant. Workers gained bargaining power they had rarely possessed before. These changes weakened the traditional feudal system that had dominated medieval Europe. Under feudalism, peasants were often tied to the land of their lords. After the plague, many could move more freely in search of better opportunities. The social hierarchy began to shift. Landowners struggled to maintain large agricultural estates. With fewer workers available, fields often went unplanted. Some landowners were forced to reduce rents or offer incentives to attract laborers. Others abandoned certain lands entirely. Peasants in many regions experienced increased mobility after the plague. They could move between villages seeking higher wages or better conditions. This greater freedom gradually reshaped rural society. Over time, the rigid structure of medieval labor began to loosen. Governments tried to stop wages from rising too quickly. Leaders feared economic instability if workers gained too much bargaining power. Laws were passed to restrict wages and control labor movement. These efforts were only partly successful. In England, one such law was the Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351. This law attempted to set wage limits and require workers to accept employment at pre-plague rates. Authorities hoped it would stabilize the economy. In practice, enforcement proved difficult. Despite these laws, wages continued to rise in many places. Labor shortages were simply too severe to ignore. Employers still needed workers to maintain farms and businesses. Over time, economic realities often overpowered legal restrictions. Some regions experienced short-term economic decline due to the sudden loss of population. Markets shrank, trade slowed, and production dropped. However, the long-term effects were more complex. In some places, the reduced population eventually led to higher living standards for survivors. The Black Death deeply influenced art throughout Europe. Artists began to explore themes of mortality and the fragility of life. Paintings, murals, and sculptures frequently depicted death as an unavoidable force. These images reflected the trauma society had experienced. One famous theme that emerged was the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre. These artworks showed skeletons leading people from every social class toward the grave. Kings, priests, peasants, and merchants were all portrayed together. The message was clear: death comes for everyone. The Dance of Death theme appears in murals, manuscripts, and church decorations. It served as a reminder of human mortality. Viewers were encouraged to reflect on the fleeting nature of life. These images remained popular for centuries. Writers also documented the plague in powerful ways. One of the most famous accounts appears in Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. This collection of stories begins with a vivid description of the plague in Florence. The work offers a valuable glimpse into how people experienced the disaster. The constant presence of death changed how people thought about life and religion. Some individuals became more devoted to spiritual practices. Others questioned institutions that seemed unable to protect society. The plague reshaped beliefs in subtle but lasting ways. The Black Death reshaped European society in ways that lasted for centuries. Entire social structures were forced to adapt to the sudden loss of population. Many traditions and institutions that had seemed permanent were suddenly weakened. In this sense, the plague helped push Europe toward major social transformation. Urban economies eventually began to recover after the initial devastation. Surviving craftsmen and merchants sometimes found greater demand for their goods. With fewer competitors, some individuals were able to accumulate wealth more quickly. Cities slowly rebuilt their populations over generations. The pandemic may have accelerated technological and agricultural innovation. Labor shortages encouraged landowners to adopt more efficient farming techniques. Tools and machineries that reduced manual labor became more valuable. These changes gradually improved productivity. In some regions, diets improved after the plague. With fewer people competing for food resources, survivors sometimes had better access to meat, dairy, and grain. These ideas were still primitive, but represented an important step forward. Over time, they laid the groundwork for modern public health policies. Some Italian cities began experimenting with quarantine systems. Officials required ships arriving from infected areas to wait before passengers could enter the city. This waiting period allowed time to see whether illness would appear. Although imperfect, the system helped reduce outbreaks. The word quarantine comes from the Italian phrase 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships suspected of carrying disease were required to remain isolated for this period. Crew members and passengers stayed aboard while authorities monitored them. If no illness appeared, they were allowed to disembark. Special quarantine stations, known as lazaretos, were eventually built near some ports. These facilities housed travelers and goods suspected of carrying disease. Officials inspected cargo and monitored the health of those staying there. Such systems became more common in later centuries. The memory of the Black Death influenced later responses to disease outbreaks. Governments and city leaders tried to learn from the earlier catastrophe. Measures such as quarantine, travel restrictions, and sanitation became more organized. These practices slowly improved over time. The Black Death also changed how people thought about medicine and science. The failure of traditional explanations encouraged some scholars to question old beliefs. Gradually, curiosity about the natural causes of disease increased. This intellectual shift contributed to the later development of scientific medicine. The bacterium responsible for plague was finally identified in 1894. During a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, scientists were able to isolate the microorganism. This discovery marked a major step forward in understanding the disease. It confirmed that plague was caused by bacteria rather than supernatural forces. Two scientists independently identified the plague bacterium, Alexandre Yersin and Kitasato Shibasaburo. Both researchers were working to understand the outbreak in Hong Kong. Their work helped establish the foundations of modern bacteriology. The bacteria was later named Yersinia pestis in honor of Yersin. Modern medicine can treat plague using antibiotics if it is caught early. Drugs such as streptomycin and doxycycline are effective against the bacteria. With prompt treatment, survival rates are much higher than in the past. However, untreated plague can still be dangerous. Although the Black Death ended centuries ago, plague has not disappeared entirely. The bacterium still exists in natural animal reservoirs. Wild rodents in some regions continue to carry the disease. Occasionally, humans become infected through contact with these animals. Plague outbreaks can occur in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Most cases appear in rural areas where humans interact closely with wildlife. Modern health systems usually detect and treat cases quickly. As a result, large pandemics are now extremely rare. The United States reports a small number of plague cases each year. Most occur in the western states where certain rodent populations carry the bacteria. These cases are usually isolated and treatable. Public health authorities monitor them carefully. Improved sanitation has greatly reduced the risk of large plague outbreaks. Better waste management limits rat populations in cities. Public health systems also track disease outbreaks more effectively. These changes make modern societies far more resilient to epidemics. Scientific research continues to study the plague bacterium. Understanding how it spreads helps scientists prevent future outbreaks. Researchers also examine how the bacteria survive in animal populations. This knowledge helps public health officials respond quickly when cases appear. Archaeologists and geneticists have also studied the Black Death using ancient DNA. By examining human remains from plague graves, researchers can detect traces of the bacterium. This work confirms the presence of Yersinia pestis in medieval victims. It also helps track how the disease evolved over time. These scientific discoveries have improved our understanding of medieval pandemics. They reveal how diseases moved across continents long before modern transportation. Researchers can now reconstruct ancient outbreaks with surprising accuracy. This knowledge helps historians better understand the past. The Black Death remains one of the most transformative events in world history. It reshaped economies, societies, and cultural attitudes across large parts of the world. Entire generations lived through its devastating effects. Its legacy continues to influence historical study today. More than 6 centuries later, the Black Death still captures the imagination of historians and scientists. It serves as a reminder of how vulnerable societies can be to disease. At the same time, it illustrates how humanity gradually learns from catastrophe. Through science and public health, the lessons of the past continue to guide the future. That brings us to the end of tonight's episode. If you'd like to hear more calm explanations like this, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And a quiet thank you to the supporters who help make this show possible. If you'd like to support the show as well, you can join them through the Patreon link in the description. Until next time, sleep well.